The man I was supposed to marry stole my life savings to fund a business with his secret lover. He thought I'd be left with nothing, but he never realized I was the only thing holding his entire career together. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I remember the exact moment the world I thought I knew tilted on its axis. It wasn't a slow realization or a creeping suspicion. It was sudden, brutal, and utterly impossible to ignore. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found a legal notice, stamped and official looking. That immediately made my heart skip a beat. My fishing business, the very lifeblood of my family for generations, had been sold. Without my consent, without even a whisper to me. I felt the first sharp pangs of disbelief. I blinked at the paper as if staring harder could erase the words. But the ink didn't lie. The sale was real, and the buyer was someone I barely recognized. Someone my parents had apparently trusted to handle something they didn't think I'd notice. My stomach turned over, a cold, hard knot forming in the pit. Betrayal is a funny thing. It's not just the shock of someone taking what's yours, but the weight of having been underestimated so completely. I immediately called my parents, trying to keep my voice steady, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of hearing panic. What is this? I asked, holding the notice like it might somehow defend me from their explanation. The silence on the other end was deafening, and when my mother finally spoke, it was in a tone that made my blood run cold. Casual, almost apologetic, as though she were discussing a minor inconvenience. Instead of the erasure of decades of my life's work, they had sold the business to fund my sister's PhD. That was the reason. That was supposed to make me understand. That was supposed to make me forgive them. But what I felt in that moment was nothing close to understanding. I felt small, disrespected, and above all, furious. Not just at the sale itself, but at the assumption that I would simply accept it. The assumption that I had no agency in the one thing I had poured myself into entirely. And it wasn't just money or ownership, it was a legacy. Every wooden boat, every creaking dock, every early morning when I stood in the misty harbor while the rest of the world slept. It was all tied to my identity, my history, and my future. And suddenly, all of that had been treated as disposable, a pawn to achieve someone else's academic ambitions. In that first, dizzying hour, I couldn't think clearly. I felt like I was floating, watching myself react with horror and anger, yet unable to stop the rapid succession of thoughts. How could they do this? Did they ever respect me? Did my sister even know? Each question felt heavier than the last, pressing down on me with the weight of inevitability. But even amid that storm of shock and hurt, one thought emerged with crystalline clarity. They had underestimated me. They had assumed my silence and trust were weaknesses. And if there was one thing I knew about myself, it was that I would not let anyone, even my own family, make a mockery of what I had built without a fight. That was the moment the story truly began, not when the sale was finalized, not when the documents were signed, but when I realized I was still very much capable of reclaiming what was mine. The business was gone in their eyes, but in mine, the battle had only just begun. Before the storm hit, before the betrayal unfolded so sharply, my life had a rhythm I had taken for granted. I was deeply embedded in the daily workings of our family fishing business, a role that had been part of me for as long as I could remember. Mornings began before sunrise, with the smell of salt in the air and the steady creak of wooden boats returning from the night's catch. My hands were calloused from work, my mind always planning, organizing, anticipating the ebb and flow of both the sea and the market. I prided myself on being reasonable, dependable, and, more importantly, fair. Customers trusted me, employees relied on me, and for the most part, life had a sense of quiet stability. The business wasn't just a livelihood, it was a heritage. Every plank of the docks, every net mended in the small workshop behind our home, carried echoes of my ancestors. It was a life built on diligence, consistency, and loyalty. I never considered my own work exceptional, just necessary, but it was the glue that held the business together. And then there was my family, my parents, who had raised us with a mix of warmth and discipline, always had a way of asserting control that could be both nurturing and suffocating. My mother was meticulous, almost obsessively so, with finances and planning, while my father had a dry, subtle sense of authority that made questioning him feel audacious. On paper, they were reasonable people, but in reality, their decisions often came with strings I hadn't fully seen until it was too late. My sister, in contrast, was younger, ambitious, and completely unaware of the subtle manipulations that often occurred behind the scenes. She was bright, curious, and deeply committed to her studies, which made her the perfect candidate for my parents' grand plan. I loved her dearly, but I now realize how easily she became a pawn in a scheme she never asked to be part of. In those early days, before everything fell apart, the warning signs were subtle, almost imperceptible. There were hushed phone calls my parents made when they thought I wasn't listening, sudden urgent trips to the bank, and a growing insistence that I should focus more on operational matters than strategic decisions. At the time, I chalked these behaviors up to typical parental involvement. After all, this was their business too, and perhaps I was being overly sensitive. Life had a rhythm, though, and I had a place in it. The mornings at the docks, the afternoons handling accounts, the evenings planning expansions, it all felt manageable. I could see the horizon clearly, and I trusted that, at least in matters of the family business, respect and fairness would guide decisions. I had no reason to suspect that the foundation I was standing on would suddenly be ripped from beneath me. That calm, that order, was precisely what made the impending betrayal so devastating. I had operated under the assumption that loyalty and transparency were mutual values in my family. That assumption, it turned out, would be the first casualty in a series of events that would leave me questioning not only my parents' integrity but my own understanding of trust. And yet, even in hindsight, I can see that the normal world was more complex than I realized. There were quiet currents of ambition and favoritism swirling beneath the surface, shaping decisions in ways I hadn't recognized. My parents, for all their experience and wisdom, had made a choice rooted in their perception of what was best without considering the human cost. My sister, blissfully unaware of the machinations, continued her studies, her dreams intact, untouched by the storm brewing in our family's backyard. In that prelude to chaos, I was calm, competent, and utterly unaware of the upheaval about to arrive. But it was in this world of routine and predictability that the seeds of betrayal took root. And when the inciting incident finally struck, the contrast between what I thought was secure and the reality of deception would make every emotion sharper, every shock more profound, and every decision more consequential. The day I realized the full extent of the betrayal is etched into my memory like a photograph I can't unsee. It wasn't a vague feeling of unease or a whispered suspicion. It was a single, undeniable event that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, my business, and even myself. I had already been feeling a subtle tension for weeks, My parents' odd behavior, hushed conversations that abruptly stopped when I entered the room, and sudden financial inquiries that seemed strangely secretive. I chalked it up to routine parental involvement, as I often did, never imagining that the moment of reckoning would be so dramatic. It started when I walked into the office to find a formal letter addressed to me, stamped with the seal of a law firm I had never interacted with before. My heart sank the instant I recognized the nature of the letter. I tore it open with trembling hands, scanning the words faster than my brain could process them. The business I had nurtured, the very essence of my family legacy, had been sold. Not a loan, not a stake sold, as if it were a commodity to be traded at whim. And the buyer was someone outside our family circle, a third party who had been carefully positioned by my parents to take control. The knot in my stomach tightened, and my mind immediately raced to my sister. Had she known about this? Was she complicit? I called her instantly, only to hear the same confusion in her voice that I felt coursing through my own veins. She had been completely in the dark, focused on her academic pursuits, entirely unaware that the foundation of her financial security had been laid atop the sale of my hard work. The realization that she was unknowingly part of their scheme only added to the bitter taste in my mouth. Then came the confrontation. I demanded answers from my parents, my voice steadier than I felt, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing panic. I asked them directly, why? How could you sell the business without even consulting me? My mother's response was calm, almost rehearsed, and my father's a silent shrug that felt like a punch to the gut. They told me, almost matter-of-factly, that the sale was to fund my sister's PhD, that it was for her future, and that I should understand and be proud. Understand, be proud. The words landed like stones. In that instant, it wasn't just the business I felt had been taken from me, it was trust, respect, and every unspoken assumption that my opinions mattered in matters that directly affected my life. The sale wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a profound violation, a line crossed that made it clear my family saw me as powerless. Sitting in the office, holding the letter in my hands, I felt a swirl of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and hurt, certainly, but beneath all of it, a spark of determination flickered. I couldn't let this stand. I had spent years building not just a business but a life intertwined with it, and now it had been stripped away in a moment of thoughtless or perhaps calculated greed. The cold reality was clear. If I didn't act, everything I had worked for would vanish, and there would be nothing left but regret. At that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. I would reclaim what was mine, not out of spite, not simply for revenge, but because justice demanded it. This was no longer about a business, it was about principle, fairness, and the refusal to allow myself to be treated as disposable. The betrayal had awakened a resolve I hadn't known was there, a clarity of purpose that would guide every decision in the days to come. As I left the office that day, the weight of the legal notice still pressing against my chest, I began to formulate the first outlines of a plan. I would need patience, intelligence, and a keen understanding of both family dynamics and legal structures. But one thing was certain. I had crossed the threshold from being a passive victim to an active strategist. The line had been crossed, and from this point forward, I would navigate the path forward on my own terms. The inciting incident wasn't just a moment of shock, it was a catalyst. It ignited the chain of events that would eventually lead to the downfall of those who underestimated me and the restoration of a legacy that was never truly theirs to take. After the initial shock of discovering my family had sold my fishing business, I had hoped for some semblance of understanding, a chance for them to recognize the gravity of what they had done. But instead, the situation escalated in ways I could never have anticipated. My parents doubled down, as if daring me to challenge them. Every conversation, every interaction became a reminder that they believed their decision was final, and that I was powerless to change it. At first, they tried subtle tactics to manipulate my response. My mother, with her calm, precise words, attempted to frame the sale as a noble act. "We're helping your sister achieve her dreams. You should be proud, not angry." The tone was maddeningly gentle, like the soft hiss of a wave eroding a cliff, hiding the force of the underlying betrayal. My father, silent but equally firm, seemed almost amused by my distress, as if watching me squirm were some form of entertainment. They even went so far as to flaunt the supposed success of their plan. Letters arrived detailing tuition payments, seminar fees, and research grants, all tied to my sister's academic achievements. The subtle message was unmistakable. "Look what we've accomplished with your sacrifice." And while part of me wanted to focus on my sister's happiness, I couldn't ignore the cruel irony. My hard work, my inheritance, my business, all leveraged to elevate someone else without my consent. The humiliation burned deep, sharper each time they paraded the results in my face. Even their friends and extended family were drawn into the web. Casual remarks, congratulatory nods, and offhand comments about how helpful my parents had been made every social interaction feel like a battlefield. I could see the judgment in their eyes. My parents had spun a narrative painting me as ungrateful or overly controlling. Every new day brought another escalation. A meeting here, a discussion there, each designed to reinforce their control and undermine my confidence. Meanwhile, the business itself was being reorganized without my input. Contracts were transferred, employees subtly informed that a new owner was taking over, and my very presence at the docks began to feel awkward, almost intrusive. It was as though I were a ghost haunting my own life's work, a silent witness to the dismantling of everything I had nurtured. The stress was relentless. Nights were sleepless, filled with scenarios of loss and what-ifs, and days were heavy with polite but pointed reminders of their power. What struck me most during this period was their arrogance, the belief that their plan was infallible, that I could do nothing to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I realized, painfully, that they were playing a high-stakes game, and they assumed I was a mere spectator. That assumption would prove to be their greatest mistake. The escalation wasn't just about the business. It was about pride, about the need to assert dominance, about testing boundaries and seeing how far they could push me before I broke. And yet, beneath the anger and frustration, something else began to grow. A quiet determination, a sense of clarity amidst the chaos. I wasn't going to let them dictate the narrative. Their every action, every taunt, every flaunted success became fuel for a plan that I hadn't yet fully articulated, but could already feel taking shape. The more they pressed, the more obvious their weaknesses became in retrospect. Those days of escalation were crucial. They showed me precisely how my parents operated, their reliance on arrogance, their blind spots, and their assumption that family loyalty would always shield them. Every step they took to cement their control inadvertently revealed the avenues I could exploit. And with each moment of public and private humiliation, the seed of a calculated response began to take root in my mind, a response that would eventually turn their own actions against them in the most satisfying way. By the time the week had ended, I was no longer merely reacting. I was observing, analyzing, and mentally charting a path forward. The antagonist had doubled down, but in doing so, They had exposed the cracks in their carefully constructed facade, and those cracks would soon be the instruments of their undoing. As the days turned into weeks, the tension that had been simmering finally reached a boiling point. Every subtle slight, every calculated comment from my parents, every insinuation that I should simply accept their actions added layer upon layer of frustration. But there was one moment, the single, defining event that crystallized my decision. The breaking point when I realized I could no longer remain passive. It happened during a family gathering. Innocuous in appearance but catastrophic in effect. My parents had invited relatives over under the guise of a casual weekend dinner. On the surface, it was meant to celebrate my sister's academic achievements. But as the evening unfolded, it became painfully clear that the purpose was also to showcase the success of the business sale. They had prepared slides, shared numbers, and casually referenced deals that were made without my knowledge. There was laughter, congratulations, and, worst of all, the subtle implication that I had been bypassed because I couldn't handle it. Sitting there, listening to the words and watching the smiles of people who believed the narrative my parents had spun, I felt a cold, steady resolve take hold. A knot of frustration that had been simmering for weeks now solidified into determination. I realized that this was no longer just about reclaiming a business. It was about asserting my dignity, proving that I was not powerless, and ensuring that their arrogance would not go unpunished. The final straw came when my mother leaned in, voice soft but dripping with condescension, and said, "You have to understand, we did this for your sister. You'd never have managed the timing and funding as well as we did." The words weren't just dismissive, they were an insult to my intelligence, my dedication, and every late night, every early morning, every sacrifice I had made to keep the business afloat. In that moment, something inside me shifted. No longer was I shocked or hurt. I was angry in a precise, focused way. The kind of anger that demands action. I left the gathering quietly, slipping out before anyone noticed, and sat in the car, letting the emotions settle. It wasn't reckless fury. I felt the weight of years of careful planning, knowledge of the business, and understanding of my family's methods. But it was undeniable. I could no longer tolerate this manipulation. Passive hope for them to recognize their wrongdoing had vanished. The passive observer was gone. In her place stood someone fully aware of the leverage she held and ready to reclaim what was rightfully hers. By the end of that night, I had made a silent vow. I would reclaim the business, not through confrontation alone, but through strategy. Every document, every precedent, every piece of knowledge I had accumulated over the years would serve as tools for a precise, calculated plan. I knew the path ahead would require patience, intelligence, and cunning. But it would also demand creativity, the kind that only comes when one has been truly underestimated. This breaking point was pivotal. It transformed frustration into clarity, and clarity into purpose. I wasn't acting out of blind rage. I was moving with deliberate intent. Every slight and every condescending remark had provided me with insight into how my parents operated, their blind spots, and the very weaknesses I could exploit. From that day forward, the narrative shifted. I was no longer a passive victim of circumstance. I had crossed the threshold from reaction to action, from hurt to strategy. The breaking point was not a dramatic showdown, not a fiery argument. It was quiet, internal, and irrevocable. But it was the moment when the pieces fell into place, when I knew exactly what needed to be done. By the time I returned home, I had begun sketching the outline of my plan, gathering every legal document, contract, and proof of ownership I had meticulously filed over the years. I had discovered my unique weapon, the leverage that would allow me to turn the tables in a way that was not only effective but utterly undeniable. The breaking point had revealed itself to be not the culmination of the conflict, but the threshold to the most powerful part of the story, the plan that would secure justice. After the breaking point, I spent long, quiet hours poring over the history of the business and the paperwork that had accumulated over the years. It was in those moments of focused reflection that I stumbled upon the discovery that would change everything. I had already bought out my family's shares months earlier. I had paid in full, signed all the necessary agreements, and yet, somehow, the paperwork had never been properly filed or recorded. In essence, the sale they had orchestrated was legally invalid. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This was my leverage, my unique weapon, and it was completely under the radar. My parents and the buyer thought they had executed a flawless plan, but they hadn't accounted for this key detail. It was as if they had handed me the tools I needed to dismantle their scheme entirely, without even realizing it. The irony was delicious. Their overconfidence and arrogance had created the very opportunity for their undoing. I began meticulously mapping out my strategy. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake, it was about restoring what was rightfully mine, and doing so in a way that left no room for dispute. I organized all the contracts, receipts, and signed agreements, making sure each piece of evidence was precise and indisputable. Every signature, every date, every notarized stamp became a weapon in my arsenal. Next, I reached out to a trusted lawyer, someone with experience in business law and a reputation for navigating complex disputes. I explained the situation calmly, presenting the documentation in chronological order. The lawyer's eyes widened in recognition. Even for a professional, the situation was remarkable. The sale my parents had orchestrated could be nullified completely, but only if executed carefully and strategically. There was no guesswork, no relying on chance. This was about calculated, methodical action. I also realized the power of public perception. My parents had already flaunted their success to extended family, friends, and colleagues. If I could expose the flaw in their plan publicly, the humiliation would be unavoidable. Their arrogance had made them careless. They assumed secrecy and compliance, but they hadn't anticipated that I could take control of the narrative. By combining legal precision with strategic exposure, I could reclaim my business and ensure that the consequences were both clear and satisfying. In the quiet of my office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, I felt a sense of clarity and empowerment that I hadn't felt since discovering the sale. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. I was observing. I was ready. The plan wasn't just about reversing a transaction, it was about asserting authority, demonstrating competence, and reclaiming control in a way that my parents would never forget. Finally, I considered the timing. I needed to act at the moment when it would have maximum impact. When the sale had been fully celebrated, when they were convinced it was irreversible, the element of surprise would be essential. Their sense of invincibility, the very thing that had allowed them to proceed without my input, would become their undoing. This plan, born from careful observation, legal documentation, and strategic thinking, became my lifeline. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't chaotic, and it wasn't reliant on luck. Every detail had a purpose, every action a calculated result. And as I sat back, reviewing the steps I would take, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The pieces were in place. The unique weapon was ready. And soon, the story would reach the point where justice, at long last, would be served. The day I began executing my plan, I felt a mixture of calm focus and quiet anticipation. Every step had been mapped out meticulously, every detail considered. I knew that this wasn't a battle to be fought with anger or confrontation. It was a calculated reclaiming of what was rightfully mine. The first task was to engage my lawyer fully, submitting all the evidence that proved my prior buyout. Contracts, signed agreements, bank statements, every document was organized and verified, leaving no room for dispute. We filed the necessary legal motions to officially nullify the fraudulent sale. As my lawyer explained the process, I felt a sense of empowerment that was both satisfying and strangely serene. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, precision, and restoring order. While the paperwork processed, I reached out to key stakeholders, employees, long-term clients, and partners who had been involved in the business. I presented the facts carefully, demonstrating that the sale had been invalid and that control would revert to me. Reactions ranged from shock to relief, but most importantly, everyone recognized the legitimacy of my claim. I also understood the value of timing. My parents believed their plan was irrevocable, that they had effectively rewritten the story of the business in their favor. I allowed that belief to persist just long enough to maximize the impact. The day the legal notification arrived at their door, delivered officially through the proper channels, was the turning point. They received documentation confirming that the sale was null and void. That ownership had reverted entirely to me. At the same time, I ensured public awareness of the correction. I shared the news with the wider community, partners, suppliers, and even local business networks, carefully framing it as the rightful reclamation of a family legacy rather than a personal vendetta. The combination of legal authority and public acknowledgement left my parents with no room to maneuver. Their carefully orchestrated narrative collapsed instantly, replaced by a reality they could neither deny nor spin. During this phase, every move was deliberate. I made sure the employees understood the shift in authority, reinforcing that the business would continue under my leadership. I coordinated with my lawyer to handle any potential objections swiftly, preempting challenges with meticulous attention to detail. By controlling both the legal process and the public perception, I ensured that the execution of my plan was comprehensive, airtight, and undeniable. As I watched the pieces fall into place, I felt a calm satisfaction. This was not chaotic revenge, it was strategic, intelligent, and thoroughly justified. Each step was calculated to restore balance and demonstrate the consequences of my parents' assumptions. Their overconfidence, their belief in my passivity, had been their fatal mistake. And now, through careful execution, I was turning that mistake into a decisive victory. By the time the dust settled, the legal system, the employees, and the broader community all recognized that the business belonged to me. The plan had worked flawlessly, and the sense of justice was immediate, tangible, and satisfying. I had reclaimed not just a business, but authority, dignity, and the reassurance that foresight, patience, and intelligence would always prevail over arrogance and manipulation. The moment my parents realized they had lost was unforgettable. It didn't come with shouting or dramatic declarations. It was quieter, sharper, and more effective than any confrontation I could have staged. They received the legal notice confirming that the sale was invalid, that every contract they had signed on my behalf was legally null, and that ownership had fully reverted to me. I could almost hear the air leave the room when they read the words. Their initial reaction was denial. My mother, ever the composed strategist, looked as if she could not believe what she was seeing. Her lips parted in shock, eyes darting across the legal documents as if she could find a loophole that wasn't there. My father, silent at first, finally spoke, his voice tight and incredulous. This can't be right. But the proof was undeniable. Every signature, every date, every notarization all in my favor. The humiliation was immediate and absolute. My parents had assumed secrecy would protect them, that their careful orchestration would remain undisputed. But the irony was delicious. The very arrogance that had led them to bypass me had created the opportunity for their public and undeniable defeat. Their credibility crumbled in front of the very people who had witnessed their scheming. Employees, clients, and extended family, all those who had seen the business sold, were now confronted with the undeniable truth. The psychological blow was profound. They had spent weeks celebrating a victory that, unbeknownst to them, had been a hollow illusion. Their shock and inability to react effectively only amplified the satisfaction of the moment. I observed quietly, letting the weight of their realization sink in, knowing that any attempted denial or deflection would be futile. The tables had been turned completely, and their power over the narrative was gone. I also made a deliberate choice to maintain calm throughout the confrontation. I didn't gloat. I didn't scream. I didn't allow anger to dictate my actions. I simply presented the facts, letting the clarity of evidence do the work. There is a particular satisfaction in seeing someone confronted with the undeniable consequences of their own arrogance, especially when those consequences are a direct result of their own decisions. As the truth settled in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. My parents' attempts at explanation faltered, leaving only a tangible sense of defeat. I could see the mixture of shock, regret, and disbelief mirrored on their faces. Every assumption they had made about my passivity had been shattered. Every plan they had counted on had unraveled. And most importantly, the business, the legacy they had attempted to control, was back in my hands, legally and unequivocally. The confrontation marked the end of their control and the beginning of my restored authority. It was not violent, not dramatic in a theatrical sense, but it was absolute. The legal confirmation combined with strategic exposure left them powerless, and that powerlessness was the truest measure of justice. In that quiet, intense moment, the scales had been balanced, and the consequences of their actions had landed exactly where they belonged. The true satisfaction of victory didn't come in the legal documents or the courtroom. It came in the unmistakable, tangible restoration of everything I had built. Walking back into the office, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet triumph. The business was mine again, fully and completely, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I could breathe without the gnawing anxiety that had haunted me for weeks. I started with the employees. Each one had been caught in the crossfire of my family's decisions, uncertain where loyalty and authority lay. I called a meeting and presented the facts plainly, calmly, and confidently. There was no need for theatrics. The truth alone carried enough weight. Seeing the relief in their faces, the way they leaned in as if finally able to trust the stability of their workplace, reinforced the depth of the victory. The business wasn't just restored on paper. It was restored in practice, in spirit, and in the confidence of the people who made it run. Next came the public acknowledgement. I made contact with long-standing clients, suppliers, and local business partners to ensure they understood the situation. There was no need for drama or emotional appeals, just clear communication. That the business was secure, under rightful ownership, and ready to continue operations smoothly. Every conversation reinforced not just my authority, but the undeniable fact that the plan my parents had relied upon had failed completely. The most satisfying part, however, was the irony of my parents' defeat. The very plan they had orchestrated to secure my sister's education at my expense had collapsed entirely. Their sense of invincibility had blinded them to the simplest truth. I had already secured full ownership, and their assumptions about my inaction had been catastrophically wrong. Watching them process this, their initial disbelief slowly giving way to reluctant acknowledgement, was a quiet, perfect justice. I also took the time to speak with my sister. I wanted her to understand that she had never been at fault, that this was never about her achievements but about my parents' misjudgment. She was stunned, naturally, but grateful for the clarity and honesty the first provided. We discussed boundaries, fairness, and accountability lessons she would carry forward without the shadow of manipulation I had endured. Finally, I could return to the work I loved, the docks, the nets, the mornings before sunrise, all the things that had once been overshadowed by betrayal, now shone with renewed meaning. I was not only the rightful owner but also the architect of a restored, thriving business. Every step I took through the office, every interaction with staff and clients, reminded me that foresight, intelligence, and careful planning had won. Where arrogance and manipulation had failed, the final payoff was more than just legal or financial victory. It was the restoration of dignity, the confirmation that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage, and the affirmation that justice, when pursued thoughtfully, is both inevitable and deeply satisfying. The business, my legacy, and my autonomy were back where they belonged, and this time, fully secure. In the weeks and months following the legal resolution, life settled into a new rhythm, one built not on manipulation or betrayal, but on transparency, respect, and the knowledge that the business and my legacy were secure. The first and most obvious change was within the family dynamic. My parents, once confident in their control, had been humbled by the undeniable consequences of their actions. There were no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet, awkward acknowledgement that their assumptions had been wrong, and that the authority they tried to wield was now firmly in my hands. My sister adjusted slowly, realizing that the financial path her PhD had taken came at an unexpected cost. She expressed gratitude for my patience and clarity, acknowledging that while her ambitions were her own, she had never intended to undermine my life's work. Over time, we rebuilt a cautious but genuine bond, grounded in mutual understanding and honesty, free from the shadow of manipulation that had previously colored our interactions. Professionally, the business thrived. With full control restored, I was able to implement long-planned improvements, streamline operations, and invest in sustainable growth. Employees responded positively to the stability and clarity of leadership, and clients returned with renewed trust, impressed not just by the business's resilience but by the integrity with which it was managed. What had once been a source of stress and conflict became a platform for innovation and fulfillment. For my parents, the consequences were subtle but persistent. Their credibility in both social and professional circles was diminished, a natural result of the exposure of their failed plan. While the family bond remained, the balance of power had shifted permanently. They could no longer make unilateral decisions without consideration of my agency and insight, and this shift created a healthier, more transparent dynamic for the entire family. On a personal level, I experienced a profound sense of closure. The betrayal that had initially felt so devastating had been transformed into a powerful lesson in resilience, strategy, and self-respect. I realized that being underestimated had not been a weakness but an opportunity. I had reclaimed my business not by chance or external intervention, but through careful observation, clever leverage, and unwavering resolve. The satisfaction was complete because the outcome was earned, deliberate, and perfectly aligned with the principle of justice. Looking back, I recognize that this experience reshaped not just the business, but who I am as a person. It reinforced the importance of vigilance, the value of foresight, and the undeniable power of acting with integrity and intelligence. The family, the business, and even my sister all adapted to a new normal one where respect, transparency, and fairness were the guiding principles. The moral of the story is clear. Justice is not always instantaneous, but it is inevitable when you combine patience, strategy, and courage. Those who act with arrogance and disregard for others often create the very conditions for their own undoing, and those who remain observant, prepared, and deliberate can turn betrayal into triumph, restoring not just what was lost, but the dignity and authority that rightfully belonged to them.